Welcome to the debate. If I tell you there is an absence of evidence, I am, simply stating a factual reality. But if I tell you there is a lack of evidence, well, I am making a subtle accusation.
Right, you're projecting a judgment onto the situation.
Exactly. Today, we are examining a comprehensive guide to advanced grammar to answer a foundational question. Are the strict, intricate rules of advanced English essential for precise intellectual discourse, or are they, often just pedantic distinctions that ignore how context naturally resolves meaning? I will be arguing that strict grammatical precision is a vital tool for clarity. It allows speakers to convey subtle judgments, render accurate physical realities, and exert deliberate emphasis that might otherwise be completely lost.
And I will be arguing that while these technical distinctions offer fascinating, microscopic blueprints of how language can be structured, human communication is robustly driven by pragmatics and context. Listeners are incredibly adept at inferring meaning, making strict adherence to these prescriptive rules not just unnecessary, but frequently a barrier to natural expression.
Let's establish the philosophies underpinning our positions. From my perspective, language, at its highest level, is an instrument of precision. Advanced grammar provides the exact calibrations needed for sophisticated thought. When a speaker correctly navigates the subtle rules of prepositions, or say, correctly deploys a sentence inversion, they aren't just following arbitrary laws.
You think they're doing something much deeper.
Right. They are engaging in semantic fidelity. They are guiding the listener's mind with absolute control, ensuring that abstract concepts and physical realities are transmitted from one brain to another without degradation. If we abandon the rules, we lower the resolution of the picture we are trying to paint.
Well, I look at the mechanics of language quite differently. Context is the true engine of meaning, not the isolated rulebook. We don't communicate in vacuum-sealed, perfectly diagrammed sentences.
Obviously not, but
Let me finish. We communicate in specific situations, leveraging shared background knowledge, tone, and pragmatic cues. Hyperfixating on the exact boundaries of prepositions or rigid syntactical structures often obscures the incredibly adaptable reality of how language actually functions. Enforcing strict academic boundaries between words that overlap heavily in common usage treats human communication like computer programming. But we aren't compilers throwing error codes at a misplaced modifier. We are remarkably efficient engines of inference.
You mentioned enforcing academic boundaries, but let's look at what happens when those boundaries collapse, starting at the micro level of vocabulary. The source material draws a very sharp distinction between the phrases absence of and lack of. In casual conversation, people swap these constantly.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah, but casually swapping them destroys a built-in semantic nuance. According to the text, absence of merely reports a neutral state of affairs. It is the pure negation of a presence with no judgment implied. An absence of something can actually be highly desirable.
Right. The text uses the example, I closed the door to my room and silently rejoiced at the complete absence of noise.
Exactly. You are just reporting a fact. You want the room to be quiet, and it is. But lack of carries an inherent judgment. It structurally implies that the thing in question is required or desired, but is currently in short supply. If you say there was a complete lack of trust between them, you are signaling that trust is a necessary component that is failing to materialize.
Okay, I follow the logic.
Using lack instead of absence is like adding a heavy emotional filter to a documentary photograph. You are no longer just showing the viewer what is there. You are artificially instructing them on how to feel about it. If you use lack of when you mean absence of, you are unintentionally projecting a judgment into the world.
It's an elegant distinction on paper, I'll grant you that, but we have to ask whether that level of definitional precision is an actual requirement for understanding or just, a marker of formal education. Let's think about the cognitive load on the listener.
Cognitive load.
Yeah, if someone complains about a lack of noise when they're trying to sleep, no listener on earth is genuinely confused by the semantic mismatch. The human brain doesn't pause and think, wait, Lack implies a deficit of a desired object, so this person must desire noise to sleep.
But doesn't pet dynamic force the listener to actively translate your imprecision? You are offloading the work of clarity onto the person listening.
I wouldn't call it work at all. It's natural language processing, and the human brain does it instantaneously, without friction. The context of the situation, the fact that the person is trying to sleep, does 100% of the communicative heavy lifting. If I say lack instead of absence in that scenario, the semantic fidelity of my overall message hasn't actually degraded.
I completely disagree.
Hear me out. The listener still perfectly understands my relationship to the noise. You're arguing for the preservation of a filter, but in reality, the listener strips that filter away immediately based on context.
They might strip it away in a highly obvious scenario, like trying to sleep. But what if the context isn't so blatantly clear? What if you are drafting a legal contract, or writing a medical report, or delivering a diplomatic briefing?
Okay, the stakes are higher there.
Yes. If a diplomat reports a lack of hostility versus an absence of hostility, the policy implications could be vastly different. One implies hostility is expected and notably missing. The other simply states the current condition. Word choice is the surface layer of how we project our thoughts. If you want to see how grammar dictates our mental models, we have to look at how we construct physical space.
You're referring to the spatial prepositions outlined in the text.
I am. Let's move from abstract judgments to spatial logic. The material details specific, rigorous rules for spatial prepositions, particularly the distinction between across and through. These aren't just arbitrary vocabulary words. They are the architectural tools we use to paint an accurate three-dimensional mental model for the listener.
Right.
Across defines movement from one side of a limit to another on a surface. You swim across a river. You walk across a road. The movement stretches from boundary A to boundary B.
While through specifies movement within a volume.
Exactly. You walk through a forest or cycle through the woods. Through stresses the state of being enclosed or surrounded by the environment as you move. How the brain visualizes through the forest requires rendering trees on all sides, a canopy above, and ground below.
Sure, it creates a nice picture.
It's more than a picture. If you say, I walked across the forest, you are grammatically flattening a rich three-dimensional environment into a two-dimensional map. You are rendering the forest as a flat green shape. Maintaining this prepositional distinction is vital for accurate spatial rendering.
Oh, come on. You can't genuinely tell me that saying across the forest instead of through the forest completely breaks a listener's mental model. If I tell you I walked across the forest, you don't suddenly picture the trees turning into a flat piece of paper.
I'm not saying you picture a piece of paper.
The noun itself, the forest, supplies the volume. The listener already knows what a forest is.
But why rely solely on the listener's pre-existing knowledge of the noun to salvage your sentence? The preposition should reinforce the physical reality, not contradict it.
It doesn't contradict it, because these spatial rules are not the immutable laws of physics you're making them out to be. They are incredibly porous, arbitrary habits of language.
Arbitrary?
Totally arbitrary. The source material itself highlights the contradictions within these very rules. Take the words over and across. The text notes that they can often be used interchangeably as adverbs. You can say we walked over to the shop or we walked across to the shop. Both mean the shop is on the other side of the flat street.
That's true, but...
But wait, the prescriptive rule for over dictates that it refers to a higher position, like a plane flying over a city. Yet here it is, functioning exactly like across on a two-dimensional plane. The strict logic breaks down the minute you look at everyday usage.
It doesn't break down. It simply has categorized functions. Over as a preposition governs vertical space, but over as an adverb takes on an idiomatic trajectory. You're conflating two different grammatical mechanisms.
But the fact that it's idiomatic proves my point entirely. It's convention, not rigid spatial geometry.
And the breakdown is even more obvious when we look at regional inconsistencies.
Which inconsistencies?
The text explicitly points out that when mapping space onto time, Americans say Monday through Friday. They are taking that 3D surrounding preposition and applying it to the concept of time, treating the workweek as a continuous volume you move inside of.
Which makes perfect conceptual sense. It makes metaphorical sense. But the British don't use it that way at all. They say from Monday to Friday, treating time as a vector pointing from A to B. If through possessed an inherent universal logic of being surrounded by a medium, it would apply universally across the language. Instead, these spatial and temporal prepositions are driven entirely by localized cultural consensus.
I don't see how a regional difference in temporal metaphor invalidates the utility of the rule in physical space. Yes, Americans and Brits conceptualize the metaphor of time differently. But when we are talking about tangible, physical reality like a forest versus a bridge, the distinction between through and across holds fast.
I still think context does the work. But a bridge has no volume to surround you. A forest does. When we blur that distinction, our language becomes inherently less vivid. But if you think spatial mapping is just arbitrary convention, let's look at how we sequence information. Spatial mapping is one thing, but informational mapping is where the real architecture of thought happens.
You want to talk about macro sentence structure, the syntax section?
Precisely. Advanced syntax is the ultimate tool for directing the listener's focus, and this is where prescriptive rules are truly indispensable. Let's take cleft sentences. In a standard declarative clause, you have a subject, a verb, and an object. Nina's car got broken into. It's perfectly fine. It delivers the factual data.
Right. SVO, very straightforward.
But human communication is rarely just about transferring raw data. We need to manage the flow of information in the listener's working memory, and cleft sentences split the information to manage that flow.
Yes, a cleft sentence cleaves a single message into two distinct clauses to purposefully isolate new information from what is already understood. And there are specific mechanisms for this. Take the it cleft. Imagine a conversation where someone asks, "Sharon's car got broken into yesterday, did it?" You reply, "No, it was Nina's car that got broken into."
Ah, I see.
The old, understood information that a car was vandalized is pushed to the back. The new, critical information, Nina's car, is thrust to the front and framed by the dummy pronoun it.
Or the well cleft, which does the reverse.
Exactly. A W cleft uses a W word, usually what, to gather all the established information into a single clause, delaying the new information to build anticipation. What we need to do is get new batteries. The what we need to do encapsulates the shared problem, and get new batteries delivers the solution at the very end, utilizing a principle called end weight.
End weight, right?
You are literally engineering the psychological reception of the information. If we abandon these complex structures in the name of simplicity, we lose our ability to carefully organize the flow of old versus new information.
I don't deny that cleft sentences are a fascinating piece of structural engineering, but you were describing a solution to a problem that spoken language already solves without them. You are treating human communication as if it solely exists in written text. How so?
Well, in writing, you absolutely need syntactic tricks to guide the reader's focus, because the text is silent. But in speech, context and prosody provide that psychological framing naturally.
Prosody?
Yeah, the rhythm and intonation. If you say, "I don't know what to cook for them," and I simply reply with the standard SVO sentence, "They like smoked salmon," the stress of my voice on the words smoked salmon achieves the exact same isolation of new information as a complex cleft sentence. Spoken language uses pitch, tone, and volume to do the job that advanced grammar has to do in writing.
But that assumes spoken language is always perfectly executed. How often do people mumble or misplace their verbal emphasis in the heat of the moment? Advanced structural grammar acts as a cognitive failsafe. It doesn't rely on the speaker acting like a trained voice actor.
But importing those written structures into daily speech often creates an unnatural, heavy-handed dynamic. This is especially true with the inversions the text discusses.
I strongly disagree. Inversions are incredibly powerful. By taking a negative adverb, placing it at the front of the sentence, and then inverting the subject and auxiliary verb, you create immense dramatic weight. Not until I got home did I realize my wallet was missing. Or, never have we witnessed such cruel behavior.
They carry dramatic weight, yes, but they don't carry different factual data. I have never witnessed such cruel behavior means the exact same thing, and realistically, using inversions with negative adverbs in daily discourse often sounds utterly performative.
Performative?
Yes, imagine sitting at a casual lunch and saying to a colleague, "Seldom does one hear the boss apologize." You wouldn't sound precise. You would sound like you were delivering a Victorian theatrical monologue. It prioritizes rhetorical flourish over straightforward, authentic clarity.
But that is exactly the point of having a varied linguistic register. Not every conversation happens at a casual lunch. What if you are delivering a eulogy? What if you are arguing a complex legal case before an appellate judge? What if you are writing a persuasive editorial? You need that performative weight. You need structures that signal gravity and formality.
I agree that it expands your rhetorical options. Having a broader toolkit is undeniably useful, but my argument is that enforcing these structures as the pinnacle of advanced English ignores the fact that simplicity is often the most precise form of communication. When we become obsessed with the rules, we sometimes create logical puzzles rather than communicative necessities.
Give me an example of a grammatical rule creating a logical puzzle.
Gladly. Let's look at the text's breakdown of tense logic, specifically the difference between "I didn't think of that" and "I hadn't thought of that."
Yes, that is a crucial distinction in the timeline of cognition. I didn't think of that uses the simple past. It refers to a specific, isolated point in the past with no link to the present. I was locked out, and I didn't think to check my pockets.
Right.
Whereas the past perfect, I hadn't thought of that, implies a duration of time up until a specific moment. It means that up until you just mentioned it, the idea never occurred to me, but now it has.
Precisely. And the text makes a very firm prescriptive note here. It states that you cannot logically say, "I haven't thought of that" in this scenario.
Which is true.
But why? Because the present perfect haven't links to the exact present moment. And since the person just suggested the idea to you, you are currently thinking of it. It's an elegant, airtight logical trap. But here is the reality. Native speakers say "I haven't thought of that" all the time to mean "I hadn't considered that until you just mentioned it."
And when they do, they are making an error that slightly blurs the timeline of their own cognition.
But the listener knows exactly what they mean. No listener stops and says, "Wait, you use the present perfect, which means you still aren't thinking of it, even though we are currently discussing it." The strict grammar rule here insists that it's logically impossible to use the phrase, but the pragmatics of human interaction override the logic instantly. We infer, we adapt, and the meaning survives perfectly intact.
It survives, yes. But at what cost to the clarity of the language over time? Why should we settle for blurred timelines when the language provides us with the past perfect, a tense specifically engineered to show an action occurring right up to a point in the past? By preserving these distinctions, we preserve our ability to articulate the exact microscopic sequence of our own thoughts.
Because language is a living ecosystem, not a museum exhibit. When enough people use a structure that technically violates a historical rule, the ecosystem adapts to accommodate it.
Well, let me bring us toward a summary of where we stand, because I think this divergence highlights our core disagreement beautifully. Throughout this discussion, I have argued that advanced grammatical distinctions are essential tools for precision. Whether we are talking about semantic judgments, like understanding why a lack creates a deficit, while an absence simply exists, or the three-dimensional rendering of spatial prepositions, or the psychological engineering of cleft sentences and inversions, these rules are not chains that bind us. They are instruments that empower us. They allow a speaker to articulate complex thoughts with maximum semantic fidelity. To dismiss them as merely academic or performative is to willfully discard the sharpest tools in our communicative toolbox.
And my summary would be this. While these advanced rules offer a truly fascinating glimpse into the historical and structural mechanics of formal English, true communicative power lies in pragmatic flexibility.
Right.
The human mind is not a fragile compiler that crashes if a preposition isn't perfectly mapped to a 3D space or if a tense timeline is slightly misaligned. We use context, prosody, and shared understanding to bridge the gaps. Rigid adherence to these technicalities often serves to police language rather than facilitate it. The most effective communication is often the most natural, adapting seamlessly to the listener and the environment, rather than strictly to a textbook.
It seems we have found a point of convergence, however narrow it might be. I think we can both acknowledge that in casual, everyday settings, context often saves us from miscommunication. And conversational flexibility is key. You certainly don't need a Wycliffe sentence to ask someone to pass the salt.
Exactly. And I can certainly concede your point that mastering these advanced structures undeniably expands one's rhetorical toolkit. For highly formal environments, for academic writing, or for deliberate persuasion, knowing how to perfectly deploy an inversion or a precise spatial preposition gives you a level of deliberate control that casual context simply cannot guarantee. Knowing the rules allows you to leverage them effectively.
Fair enough. And for those listening, the source material we explored today contains dozens of further nuances we didn't even have time to dissect.
Oh, absolutely. We didn't even touch on the terrifying world of dangling participles. Sentences like, traveling to Finland, the weather got colder, which technically implies that the weather itself packed a suitcase and took a flight to Helsinki.
A perfect example of why structural precision matters, or the incredibly subtle cognitive distinction between using do it versus do so, where do so focuses on an abstract, generalized process, while do it requires a highly specific noun antecedent. There is a vast landscape of language mechanics out there, leaving each of you to decide for yourselves how strictly you wish to police the boundaries of your own communication.
Which brings us right back to the central tension of the debate.
Indeed. We began by asking if these rules were essential for precise discourse. It turns out advanced grammar might just be the X-ray machine of human thought. It's entirely up to you whether you want to turn the machine on to see the exact, rigorous skeleton of what you're saying, or if you prefer to trust the adaptable, sometimes murky waters of natural context.